Howdy folks. So one of the questions that I've been asked several times in previous videos are what host bus adapters for SATA do you use in your machines, and what do you recommend people use? And I don't really use kind of enterprise class HBAs like I really should, and I kind of have cobbled together my setup using cheap consumer grade low port count devices. So I really can't recommend any cards on the market because I simply don't use them. I mean, just go with what other professionals use, something probably by LSI or Adaptec or something like that. All I can recommend is that it have full proper JBOD pass-through support. If it doesn't have that, don't buy it, because things like ButterFS and ZFS really don't work properly, or even any kind of software RAID like MD RAID. They don't work properly if your controller doesn't expose the raw drives to the OS. But anyway, that's not the focus of this video. One of the controllers that I see myself buying quite a lot is the ASMedia ASM1061, which is a dual SATA port PCI Express chipset that runs 2 disks at up to SATA 3, which is 6 gigabits per second per port. And I have about 3 of these cards in a bunch of machines all over the place. And these cards, which have 2 internal ports, they usually go for about $30 plus tax. That's what I can pick them up at my local computer store for. Now, I was looking on eBay, and I found this card, which is an ASMedia 1061, supposedly, chip with 2 internal ports or 2 external eSATA ports. Even though there are 4 ports on this card, you can only use 2 at a time. So you can use 2 internal, 2 external, or 1 internal and 1 external. So it's up to you what configuration you want, but you can't plug 4 things in at once. And because, of course, that's a limitation of this chip. So this card was delivered to me for $6. So the purpose of me buying this was just to sort of take a look at these direct from China cards, and if this truly is a genuine ASM1061 and the card quality is good, then why am I paying $30 for these things when I can just buy them off eBay for $6? Yeah, I know there's a 2 or 3 week lead time, but if you don't need it right away, it saves you quite a bit of money. So this video, I just want to go over this card really in detail to see how good quality this is, because this, in any data storage setup, the HBA that you choose really has to be trusted, because of all of the components in the storage setup, other than disks failing, if your SATA controller fails, you are fucked. I mean, they can fail in nice ways, but they can also fail in really, really not so nice ways, and they can destroy data. So generally, you want to trust your HBA as much as possible. So would I put this in a production environment? Probably not, but if I need to quickly attach some drives to a machine, or there's a workstation or something that I need to add drives to, I definitely use this card. That my TLDR is this is actually a great card for $6, and it's the same or better quality than the stuff that I can buy at my local computer shop. So I want to go over this in a bit more detail, and I'm going to just go over what's on the card. I also want to get out my microscope and look at the quality of the solder joints, see how that's done, and then I've got a test bench. I'm going to plug this in and see how the device enumerates. So the first thing you'll notice on this is it's got an interesting texture to the actual board, and you'll see this more under the microscope. And it's actually kind of interesting. It's not they're not like micro vias, I don't think anyway. It's just a pattern basically, which is kind of gives it a matte finish kind of. It's a shiny solder mask with dimples on it basically. And of course the connectors are all through hole, and they all look good from the wide angle. When I get the microscope out, we can see the quality of those in more detail. But we've just got a 20 megahertz crystal here. We've got the ASMedia 1061 chip We have a WinBond chip of some type, which is most likely, I believe it's E2PROM configuration memory for that. We have a what I believe is a 3.3 volt regulator. It looks like an LDO here, just for the power supply for that chip. And we have two sets of jumpers here. And these jumpers are what allow you to select what port you want to use. So there's a little table here for connector 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're labeled on the silk screen. Connector 4, 3, and connector 1 and 2. And basically this table basically tells you where these jumpers are supposed to be for each port. So the way that this actually works is this chip is connected to all the ports, but these are the selectors. So instead of using dip switches, they've used jumpers, and because jumpers are cheaper than dip switches, which is perfectly acceptable. Generally, you won't be switching this around very often. I only just recently purchased eSATA cables. I've really never found a use for eSATA. So I bought some cables that are eSATA to regular SATA, but most people probably will want to use the two internal ports, and it's configured by default for the two internal ports. But if you want to switch one of these over to these, you just move all four jumpers on one block over to the other pin, and you'd use this one for these two and this one for these two, I believe. But you can consult the table, of course. The other thing that I've noticed is there is actually a little LED down in the corner here. It's a little red LED, and that flashes whenever there's disk activity on any of the ports. So it's the sum, basically, of all the activity on the ports, which is really nice. The new cards that I buy from my computer store don't have that, which I'm a sucker for flashing lights, so I actually like that feature quite a bit, and I'm surprised that other cards don't seem to have that. The PCI Express X1 connector is pretty conventional. It's gold-plated, as you would expect, and the gold plating looks actually quite good. It looks to be of sufficient thickness, unlike the incredibly cheap coatings that I've seen on some things that are basically, you have to look in the right light to tell it's even gold at all, but this looks perfectly fine. It's got that sort of horrifying QC pass sticker that you see on stuff, but that doesn't scare me too much. There's the rivets, of course, or not rivets, sorry, they're screws. They look kind of like press fit on the bottom, but they are indeed screws. So you could remove this bracket and attach a low profile bracket if you so chose to do so. This thing also comes with, quite interestingly, it comes with a little mini CD, which I haven't bothered to open because I'm not entirely sure what's on this, and I don't really think I'm ever going to bother to find out. There's drivers for this in every OS imaginable at this point. It's a very common chip, so whatever's on this disk, you probably don't need it. This maybe if it's got a raw like driver file for Windows, maybe if you're like installing Windows, like an old version of Windows, and this is your boot drive's plugged into this, maybe Windows will need this disk, but other than that, I can't see a need for that. So as for the ASM1061 chipset, it's actually not a bad SATA controller for light duty use. It's survived pretty well. I mean, I've got it in my file servers, and it seems to be doing just fine. Now, of course, the chip is not capable of actually allowing both plugged-in disks to saturate, because, of course, it's just a PCI Express X1 slot. And this is, of course, PCI Express version 2.0, which means it's 5 gigabits per second. So you have the potential of 12 gigabits per second here and only 5 here. So there is a bottleneck here. But most disks, I mean, if you're not using high-speed SSDs, like you're just using mechanical hard drives, you probably won't be able to saturate this. So here we are under the microscope, and this is what the bare PCB looks like. It's got this interesting 3D dimpled pattern on it, which is kind of neat, but I don't think that's terribly important. What's important are the quality of the solder joints on this, both through-hole and surface mount. So this is the chip, which I will give you a look at first of all. So this is the ASM1061, and as far as I can tell, it appears genuine. The date code at the bottom there is 45th week of 2015. So this was a relatively recent manufacture, given that I purchased this in early 2015. So it would have been maybe February, or 2016. It would have been around February or so. So definitely hasn't been sitting on a shelf for too long. So looking around the pins on this quad flat pack, the solder quality looks perfectly acceptable. It's not the best solder quality I've ever seen in my life, but it is by far not the worst. And it's perfectly acceptable for something like this. And electrically, it looks fine. I don't see anything wrong there. All the surface mount components, they actually appear to be pretty well soldered. They're all straight. There's nothing that's tombstoned on end. There doesn't appear to be massive globs of solder, but there also doesn't appear to be any cold joints or anything like that. So that looks fine. The silk screen looks fine. That's of course not terribly important, but it's nice to see that they've gone to trouble to do some of that stuff. This is the other chip, which I guess it would be nice if it was the correct way up. This is a WinBond. What is that part number there? Get it in the right light so you can read it. 25X20CL. That's probably E squared prom. It's a little bit older, but if it is E squared prom, then I'm not surprised that it's been sitting on the shelf for a while. And those, even with bigger pads, they all look perfectly fine in the reflow process. And this would be our regulator here. And again, it all looks fine. Our SATA connectors, which are higher thermal mass, they look fine. Again, not the best solder quality in the world, but perfectly adequate, I think, for what this is. And of course, the eSATA connectors are basically the same thing. Flipping the board over to the other side, we see the through-hole soldering, which is also perfectly acceptable. I don't see any dry joints. It all looks perfectly fine. So as far as I can tell, this thing has been assembled perfectly fine. I don't think they've messed up on the assembly. There isn't any solder residue on the bottom of this board around here. There's no flux residue. So either this was assembled by a machine through some sort of a wave soldering process or something, or they've actually cleaned this board after manual hand soldering. I'm not entirely sure which one, but definitely the board has been cleaned to some extent, because I don't see any residue on this thing at all, which is quite nice. So from the perspective of manufacturing, I don't see anything wrong with this whatsoever. So here is my test bench. This is my super old Asus P5LP-LE, which is at this point almost a decade old, a little bit over a decade old, I think. And this used to be my old pfSense router before the motherboard started to do some funky stuff. But it's adequate for this test. So I've got the card here. One thing that I did want to mention, which I didn't mention before, is how these ports actually feel when you plug a cable into them. Because one of the big things with SATA and SAS is you want to make sure that the cable has really good retention in these ports, because I've actually seen especially at one of the companies where I used to work, we actually had a machine where the cables would actually vibrate loose, and they actually caused one of our main file servers to completely lose all of the data on it due to bad cables. And I have to say that these sockets they've used are really good. When you push it in, you get this really good positive detent, and there's it's very strong, and you have to overcome that click to get the cable out again. So they grip the cables I've got, at least these red ones anyway, really, really well. So I'm very happy with the sockets they've got on this, unlike some of the ones I've seen that are really shit, where basically it's just loosey-goosey, and I really don't like that. I don't even know if they're making a good electrical connection. Some of the ones I have. But anyway, so I've got this. This is, like I said, it's a PCI Express version 1 slot, so we're not going to get the full speed out of this, but I'm just here to prove that the thing works. So I've got this disk. This is just a 1 terabyte disk here, and we can fire this up if I can find something metallic to start the motherboard with, because it does not have a case, so we'll just short that out there. And you can see the red light, and you can see that the controller will come up. There we go. And you'll notice that it says that it's a SATA 1 disk. Now, of course, it's not a SATA 1 disk. It is actually a SATA 2 disk. I believe it actually may be a SATA 3 capable disk. I don't know. But you can see the light, the activity light, as it flashes. Now, I'm not entirely sure what's on this hard drive. I think it may be a super old Windows 7 installation, maybe. I'm not quite sure what's on this disk. Oh, this is a 160 gig drive. Okay, sorry, my bad. This is not the drive I thought it was. This is probably got some old Windows installed, so it definitely is a SATA 3. It's probably a SATA 1 or a SATA 2 disk. Oh, it does actually. Okay, it is actually Windows 10. Okay. I was doing, this was from a video that I was going to do a long time ago about doing ZFS on Windows, but I never published that video, so I just kept the disk around, and I've obviously never formatted it since. So obviously it works fine with Windows. Windows is happy to boot from it, so that's not a big deal. Oh god, no graphics drivers. Oh, that's pretty terrible. Is that like 4-bit color? That looks like 4-bit color. Excellent. So I've just added another drive. This is a 1 terabyte disk, so it's a little bit newer, just so that I can have 2 disks on that card at once. And I'm going to try and boot off of a USB flash drive on here, which has Ubuntu on it. So I'll bring up the boot menu to force it to boot from that instead of Windows. So there we go. Boot from the flash drive. There's Ubuntu. Let's start that. So here we are, it's booted up. Now we can tell already that both disks were detected. So we can just do an LS bulk. And yes, I know I'm not screencasting this, but I don't really care. So there we go, we've got SDB, SDC, so both disks are mounted. And let's take a look at the kernel log. Probably should have gotten a tripod out for this, but it's a little bit late for that now. So let's take a look up here. So here we go. We have a SATA link, which is up at 6 gigabits per second. So that would be the new 1 terabyte disk that I just plugged in, because of course that is a SATA 3 capable drive. And if I can find here is where the kernel has detected the 2-port 6 gigabit per second controller. And here is the other disk, which is up at 1.5 gigabits per second, because that is a SATA 1 capable drive. So it's working perfectly fine. Both disks are detected, and they're running at their appropriate speeds. And I should be able to mount these, and I can. Well, okay, I can't mount the Windows one because Windows is in that weird not really shut down state. It marks the NTFS file system as dirty, but anyway, you get the idea that it works fine. So I'll run a benchmark. Now this won't really be super good because of course
I'm running this off of PCI Express Gen 1, but we'll do a benchmark anyway. And you can see that we're getting a pretty decent read and write rate on that drive. And it's not a terribly fast drive to begin with. It's not a fast system or a fast link to begin with, but the controller is doing exactly what I'd expect. Access time is expected. I mean, that's a perfectly valid benchmark. So, as basically all this has pretty much shown me that there's nothing wrong with this controller, and it's effectively identical, if not better, than the ones that I pay, 3 or 4 times as much for at my local computer store. So honestly, I would recommend these for anyone who needs to add 2 more disks to a system, because they're really they win in pretty much every category. I mean, they're not the best, but for $6 or $7, can you really blame them? So anyway, hopefully this was a little reassuring to anyone not sure about these, and hopefully you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.